Around 6 million years ago, the first hominids, our primate family, emerged. A major leap occurred 1.9 million years ago with Homo erectus, the first of our ancestors to leave Africa and colonize other parts of the world, equipped with larger brains than their predecessors. Then, around 400,000 years ago, we find the first evidence of the Neanderthals. Their bodies were superbly adapted to the cold climates of Europe and Western Asia, and their facial features were among the most human-like ever seen. Finally came us, Homo sapiens, the only surviving hominid species. But how did we transition from nomadic bands to global dominance through the mechanism of civilization? The answer begins in a fertile crescent between two great rivers. The agricultural revolution in Sumer, c. 4000 BCE. In 4000 BCE, in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerian city of Ur pioneered a new way of life. Unlike our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the citizens of Ur developed a way to harvest cereal grains, like wheat and barley. This was not an easy process. It required back-breaking labor using an invention called a hand mill. Two stones between which grains were crushed, with the collected flour stored for future use. This strenuous process was our world's first example of agriculture. Human ingenuity had created a reliable food source, allowing Ur to prosper into a city of over 50,000 people. However, this revolution came at a cost. The average height of men shrank from 5'9" to 5'3", and women from 5'3" to 5 feet. We were no longer the athletic nomads of the past, but smaller, landlocked farmers. The very essence of what it meant to be human had changed. As Sumer flourished, legendary figures like King Gilgamesh rose to power around 3000 BCE. But empires are transient. By the end of the millennium, the Akkadian king, Sargon the Great, had conquered all of Sumeria. While Mesopotamia developed kingship, other civilizations focused on different pillars of society. In the Indus Valley, 3300 to 1300 BCE, a remarkable civilization grew, renowned for its highly advanced, hygienic toilet and underground drainage systems, a stark contrast to their contemporaries in Egypt. The Egyptians were consumed with a different kind of construction, the pyramid. Driven by a religion that believed a pharaoh's spirit would rule eternally in the afterlife, they built monumental tombs filled with treasures. It started with Pharaoh Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, evolved through Sneferu's bent and red pyramids, and culminated in the iconic Great Pyramid of Giza, built by Pharaoh Khufu in a labor-intensive 20-year process. For the Egyptians, ensuring immortality for their bod king was the highest priority. Meanwhile, in China, another agricultural society was taking root. But as legend has it, the Yellow River constantly flooded, destroying crops and causing widespread famine. A hero emerged from this crisis, Yu the Great. Yu was so distraught by the suffering that he dedicated 13 years to traveling the river, building levees and dikes to regulate its flow. His success in taming the floods brought him immense popularity, and he was hailed as a savior, founding the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia. While historians debate the accuracy of this tale, it established a crucial precedent, the idea that power should be granted based on merit. A leader who proved his worth through great deeds deserved absolute power, an idea that would shape Chinese philosophy for millennia. Back in Mesopotamia, a new concept was being carved into stone. The Babylonian king Hammurabi ordered the creation of a massive stone slab inscribed with 282 laws. This was Hammurabi's code, the basis of a legal system as we know it. The laws were stark and specific. Law 1. If a man brings a false accusation of murder, the accuser shall be put to death. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of another, his own eye shall be destroyed. Law 199. If he destroys the eye of a man's slave, he shall pay half the slave's value. Hammurabi's code created a society based on codified law, but it was not a society of equals. It laid out a strict hierarchy, placing different values on nobles, commoners, and slaves. The value of a man's bone or eye depended entirely on his social class, cementing an idea of inherent inequality that would echo throughout history. In this first chapter, humanity laid its foundations. We mastered agriculture, built the first cities, wrestled with the divine right of kings, and established the rule of law. The stage was now set for the first great empires to clash and cooperate, shaping the world through war and diplomacy. With the foundations of civilization laid, the story of humanity accelerated. Kingdoms became empires, and for the first time, we see the rise of professional armies, complex governments, and the foundational ideas that would shape Eastern and Western thought for centuries. The Hittite war machine and the Egyptian social pyramid, c. 1680 BCE. In modern-day Turkey, the Hittite Empire rose under the charismatic ruler Labarnas, c. 1680 to 1650 BCE. A skilled warrior and shrewd diplomat, he united the Hittite city-states through conquest and alliance, creating a powerful new neighbor for Egypt. Egyptian society, meanwhile, had solidified into a rigid hierarchy, a social pyramid as imposing as the structures they built. At the base were the peasants and slaves, who farmed the land and built the monuments. Above them were the artisans, merchants, and scribes, the skilled professionals who managed the economy and recorded history. Further up were the soldiers and bureaucrats, including the powerful priests and nobles who administered the empire. At the very apex was the pharaoh, the god-king whose will was supreme. Every layer of society existed to serve him, both in life and in his quest for immortality. This system produced powerful rulers like Pharaoh Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, who constructed magnificent temples and expanded the empire. His ambition inevitably clashed with the Hittites under King Muwatalli II. The two superpowers met at the Battle of Kadesh, c. 1274 BCE. Despite Ramses' claims of victory, the battle was a bloody stalemate. Exhausted, the two empires did something unprecedented. They chose peace. The subsequent peace treaty, signed between Ramses and the new Hittite king Hattusili III in 1258 BCE, is the first such international agreement ever recorded. It promised that neither king would attack the other's lands, ushering in an era of prosperity. The Hittites shared their superior metalworking skills, and the Egyptians taught advanced agriculture. For a time, peace proved more profitable than war. While empires rose in the Mediterranean, other cultures flourished in isolation. In the Americas, the Olmec civilization, 1200 to 400 BCE, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, left behind colossal stone heads, their meaning and the names of their leaders lost to history, enshrined in silent stone. In the East, the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, overthrew the Shang, justifying their rule with a powerful new idea, the mandate of heaven. This doctrine held that heaven granted the emperor the right to rule, but only as long as he was virtuous. Natural disasters like floods and famines were signs that the mandate was lost, justifying rebellion. This created a cyclical pattern of dynastic rise and fall that would define Chinese history. The Zhou also formalized a feudal system, creating a social pyramid with the king at the top, lords below him, and peasants at the bottom, tied to the land. But as the dynasty weakened, leading to the chaotic warring states period, two profound philosophies emerged to make sense of the turmoil. Towards the end of the Zhou dynasty, Chinese thought entered a golden age. Confucius created a philosophy centered on respect, loyalty, and responsibility in relationships. His concept of Li, the rituals and customs that maintain social harmony, provided a blueprint for an orderly society. Around the same time, Lao Tzu founded Taoism. This philosophy taught alignment with the natural flow of the universe, the Tao, rather than fighting against it. Its most famous symbol, the balancing forces of yin and yang, taught that harmony comes from accepting complementary opposites. While Confucianism focused on social duty, Taoism offered a path to inner peace, making the hard life of a farmer more bearable. The Greek experiment, Sparta and Athens. On the other side of the world, a different kind of civilization was taking shape in Greece. Mycenaean Greece, from 1600 to 1100 BCE, was a network of palace-centered, warrior-led states. After its collapse, a new landscape of independent city-states, or polis, emerged, including Thebes, Corinth, and a fledgling settlement called Rome, founded, according to legend, by the fratricide Romulus in 753 BCE. Two city-states would come to define the Greek world, Sparta and Athens. Sparta was a militaristic powerhouse. From birth, life was dedicated to the state. Unhealthy infants were left to die. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 for brutal military training. Society was divided into the ruling Spartiates, free non-citizens, and a vast population of enslaved helots. Life was harsh, disciplined, and focused entirely on military prowess. Athens took a radically different path. It experimented with democracy. Every male citizen could vote in the assembly, which decided on laws, war, and peace. To manage the chaos, a council of 500 was chosen at lot, using a complex device called a cleartorion. This was democracy in its purest, most direct form. Not everyone approved. The philosopher Plato argued that governing was a skill, like navigation. In his book, The Republic, he wrote that society would be troubled until philosophers become kings, or until those we now call kings truly become philosophers. He advocated for a philosopher king, a wise ruler educated from birth to lead justly, a direct critique of the Athenian system. In India, a different kind of philosopher emerged. Prince Siddhartha Gautama, c. 500 BCE, lived a life of sheltered luxury. Venturing outside his palace, he witnessed suffering for the first time, sickness, old age, and death. This revelation led him to abandon his wealth and seek enlightenment. After years of meditation, he achieved a state of inner peace under a fig tree, becoming the Buddha, the awakened one. His teachings on overcoming suffering through the middle way would spread across the continent. As philosophy flourished, a colossal empire threatened to snuff it out. The Persian Empire, forged by Cyrus the Great, had swallowed the Greek colonies in Ionia. Its new king, Darius I, set his sights on mainland Greece. In 490 BCE, the Persians landed at Marathon, 26 miles from Athens. Vastly outnumbered, the Athenian hoplites achieved a stunning victory. A messenger named Pheidippides ran the distance to Athens to announce the victory, collapsing and dying after delivering the news, inspiring the modern marathon. But the Persians were not finished. Darius's son, Xerxes I, launched a massive invasion in 480 BCE. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 warriors made a legendary stand, holding back the Persian horde for days before being wiped out. The war was saved at the naval battle of Salamis, where the Athenian general Themistocles lured the massive Persian fleet into a narrow strait and destroyed it. Finally, at the Battle of Plataea in 439 BCE, a united Greek force defeated the Persians for good. Victorious, Athens entered a golden age, building the Parthenon and producing timeless plays by Sophocles and Aristophanes. But peace between the Greek city-states was fragile. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, pitted the Athenian Empire against the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League. A disastrous Athenian expedition to Sicily shattered its power, and Athens eventually fell to Sparta. Both states were left weakened. Into this power vacuum stepped a figure from the northern kingdom of Macedon, Alexander the Great. Tutored by the philosopher Aristotle, Alexander was a military genius. After securing his power by ruthlessly destroying the city of Thebes, he turned his attention to the Persian Empire. In a breathtaking, decade-long campaign, Alexander defeated King Darius III at the battles of Issus and Gaugamela, conquered the great cities of Tyre and Babylon, and burned the Persian capital of Persepolis. He pushed east into India, but his weary troops refused to go further. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, having spread Greek culture across the known world and creating a legacy that would shape the future of the West. In the East, another empire arose from Alexander's wake. In India, the Mauryan Empire expanded under Ashoka the Great. After a bloody conquest of Kalinga that left over 100,000 dead, Ashoka was overcome with remorse. He converted to Buddhism, renouncing violence and promoting tolerance and nonviolence through edicts carved on pillars across his empire. It was a profound moment, a conqueror who had found a different path to power through the strength of his conscience. The death of Alexander the Great shattered his vast empire, splitting it into three warring Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in the east, and the Antigonids in Greece. As they squabbled, a new power was rising in the west, methodically building an empire that would eclipse them all: Rome. Rome began as a small city-state, but its disciplined legions and pragmatic political system, a republic that mixed democratic, aristocratic, and monarchical elements, gave it a unique strength. Its first great rival was the North African maritime power of Carthage. The two civilizations clashed in the three Punic Wars. The first war, fought over the island of Sicily, ended with a Roman victory in 241 BCE. The second was defined by the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal, who famously marched his army, including war elephants, over the Alps to invade Italy from the north. He ravaged the Italian peninsula for years, winning a stunning victory at Cannae. But the Romans, refusing to surrender, eventually took the fight to Africa. Under General Scipio Africanus, they defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, ending Carthage's power. The Qin and Han dynasties, unification, and the Silk Road, 221 BCE to 220 CE. While Rome fought Carthage, China was unified by the ruthless Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE. Its first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, standardized writing, currency, and laws, and connected the Great Wall. His rule was based on the harsh philosophy of legalism, which held that humans were inherently selfish and required strict laws and severe punishments to be controlled. The Qin dynasty collapsed quickly, but was replaced by the long-lasting Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE. The Han rejected legalism in favor of Confucianism, creating a stable, virtuous bureaucracy. It was during the Han that China began producing silk in earnest, leading to the creation of the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that connected China to Central Asia and beyond. Chinese silk became a sensation in the Roman Empire, although the middlemen, the Parthians, carefully prevented the two great empires from establishing direct contact. Back in Rome, the Republic was buckling under the weight of its own success. Ambitious generals, backed by loyal legions, began to overshadow the Senate. The most famous of these was Julius Caesar. After a brilliant 9-year campaign conquering Gaul, modern-day France, Caesar had become wildly popular and powerful. The Senate, fearing him, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome. In 49 BCE, Caesar made the fateful decision to cross the Rubicon River with his legion, an act of treason that sparked a civil war. He defeated his rival Pompey and declared himself dictator for life. Caesar launched popular reforms, including creating the Julian calendar, but many senators saw him as a tyrant. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, a group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him, hoping to restore the Republic. Instead, they plunged Rome into another civil war. The war was won by Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. After defeating Caesar's assassins and his former ally, Mark Antony, Octavian stood alone as the master of Rome. In 27 BCE, he was granted the title Augustus, becoming the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead. The Roman Empire was gone. It was during the reign of Augustus that a pivotal event occurred in the remote province of Judea. To conduct a census, a man named Joseph and his pregnant wife Mary traveled to Bethlehem. Finding no room at the inn, Mary gave birth to a son in a stable. They named him Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth grew up to become an itinerant preacher, attracting followers with his teachings of love, forgiveness, and the coming of the kingdom of God. He performed miracles, according to his disciples, and was hailed by some as the Messiah. This threatened both the Jewish religious authorities and the Roman rulers. Around 30 CE, the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, bowing to political pressure, sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion. Yet his followers claimed he had risen from the dead. Led by apostles like Peter and Paul, they began to spread his teachings across the Roman Empire. This new sect, called Christianity, grew rapidly despite periods of brutal persecution, as it offered hope and community to the poor and disenfranchised. The Roman Empire reached its greatest extent under Emperor Trajan, 98 to 117 CE, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf. But holding it together was a constant struggle. Emperor Hadrian, 117 to 138 CE, famously built a wall across northern Britain to mark the empire's limit and keep out barbarians. In the east, the Han dynasty was also collapsing due to political corruption, peasant revolts, and external threats, finally falling in 220 CE. The world's two greatest empires were beginning to crumble simultaneously. For Rome, the crisis was profound. Emperor Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, tried to save it by dividing the empire into a tetrarchy, rule of 4. It was a temporary fix. Constantine the Great, 306 to 337 CE, reunited the empire and, after allegedly seeing a Christian cross in the sky before a decisive battle, legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. He later moved the capital to the newly built city of Constantinople, shifting the empire's center of gravity east. But the pressures were too great. The empire was split permanently into eastern and western halves. The west was battered by invasions. In 410 CE, the Visigoths sacked Rome itself, a profound psychological blow. The final blow came in 476 CE, when a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The Western Roman Empire was no more. In the East, however, the Roman Empire lived on. It would continue for another 1,000 years, no longer called Rome, but the Byzantine Empire, a Christian bulwark preserving the learning and laws of the classical world, while the West descended into what would be called the Dark Ages. With the fall of Rome, the unified world of the Mediterranean splintered. In the West, a new order, feudalism, rose from the ashes of empire, defined by local lords, sworn knights, and pious serfs. In the East, the Byzantine Empire and the new religion of Islam created powerful, centralized civilizations that would challenge and enlighten the West for centuries. As Rome fell in the West, the Eastern Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire, entered its own golden age under Emperor Justinian I, 527 to 565 CE. From his capital, Constantinople, he reconquered much of the old Roman territory in Italy and North Africa. His most lasting legacies were the magnificent Hagia Sophia, a cathedral that proclaimed the glory of God and Emperor, and the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification of Roman law that would become the bedrock of European legal systems. While Justinian built, a new force was emerging in the Arabian desert. In 610 CE, a merchant named Muhammad, meditating in a cave near Mecca, received a revelation from the angel Gabriel. He began preaching a strict monotheism, calling for submission, Islam, to the one God, Allah. Persecuted in Mecca, Muhammad and his followers fled to Medina in 622 CE, the Hijra, which marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Muhammad unified the tribes of Arabia under Islam, and after his death, the Rashidun caliphs launched a stunning wave of conquest. They toppled the Persian Sasanian Empire and seized the Byzantine provinces of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. By 732 CE, a Muslim army stood at the heart of France, where it was finally turned back by the Frankish leader Charlemagne Martel at the Battle of Tours. The Islamic world now stretched from Spain to India, and in its new capital, Baghdad, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, 786 to 809 CE, established the House of Wisdom, a center of learning where Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge was preserved, advanced, and later passed back to a Europe that had largely forgotten it. In the power vacuum of Western Europe, a new political and social system emerged, feudalism. It was a pyramid of mutual, if unequal, obligation. At the bottom were serfs, tied to the land, providing food and labor. Above them were knights, who provided military service in exchange for land. Above them were nobles, lords, and barons, and at the top was the king. But the ultimate spiritual authority was the Pope in Rome, who claimed sovereignty over all Christendom. This system was forged in response to constant invasion. Vikings from the north raided monasteries and sailed up rivers in their longships. Magyars from the east swept in on horseback. From the south came the Muslims. Local protection was the only security, leading people to trade their freedom to a local lord for safety. Amid this chaos, a new Roman Empire was proclaimed on Christmas Day 800 CE, when Pope Leo III crowned the Frankish king Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne's empire briefly unified much of Western Europe and fostered a cultural revival, but it did not survive his death. His grandsons split it into three in the Treaty of Verdun, 843 CE, laying the groundwork for modern France and Germany. On the edges of Europe, new kingdoms were forming. In England, Alfred the Great, 871 to 899 CE, of Wessex, unified the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to fight the Vikings, beginning the process of creating England. His grandson, Athelstan, became the first king of a unified England. In the East, according to legend, Slavic tribes, tired of internal strife, invited the Viking chieftain Rurik to rule them. He founded the Rurik dynasty, establishing the Kievan Rus state, the precursor to Russia. His successor, Prince Vladimir, famously rejected Islam, Judaism, and Western Christianity before choosing the Byzantine rite of Christianity for his people in 988 CE, forever tying Russia to the Orthodox world. Meanwhile, a world away, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson landed on the shores of North America around the year 1000 CE, establishing a short-lived settlement he called Vinland. The European discovery of the Americas would, for now, remain a footnote. The unity of Christendom was shattered in 1054 CE, in the Great Schism. Doctrinal, political, and linguistic disputes between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople boiled over, resulting in them mutually excommunicating each other. The Christian Church was now permanently divided into the Roman Catholic West and the Eastern Orthodox East. In the Holy Land, a new threat emerged to Christian pilgrims. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, had conquered Jerusalem and defeated a Byzantine empire. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, desperate for help, sent a plea to the Pope. Pope Urban II saw an opportunity to reunite Christendom under his leadership and channel the violent energies of Europe's knights. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, he gave a fiery speech, urging Christians to take up the cross and liberate Jerusalem. "God wills it" became the rallying cry. The age of crusades had begun, setting the stage for a bloody clash of faiths and cultures that would define the next 2 centuries. The Pope's call to crusade unleashed a tidal wave of religious fervor and military ambition. For the next 2 centuries, the focus of history would be on the violent and transformative encounters between East and West, while in the East, a storm was gathering on the Mongolian steppe that would create the largest contiguous land empire in history. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, was a shocking, brutal success for Europe. Against all odds, the crusading armies fought their way to Jerusalem, capturing the Holy City in a horrific massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. They established a patchwork of crusader states along the Levantine coast. The Islamic world, initially divided, slowly unified in response. The legendary Kurdish general Saladin emerged, uniting the Muslims and recapturing Jerusalem in 1187 after his victory at the Battle of Hattin. This triggered the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, the Crusade of Kings, featuring figures like Richard the Lionheart of England and Saladin. It ended in a stalemate and a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem. Subsequent crusades grew increasingly cynical and disastrous. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, never even reached the Holy Land, instead sacking the Christian city of Constantinople, a betrayal that permanently deepened the schism between Catholic and Orthodox. The Children's Crusade, 1212, ended in tragedy, with thousands of young pilgrims sold into slavery. While the Crusades ultimately failed as a permanent military enterprise, they dramatically increased cultural and trade contacts between Europe and the Middle East. As knights fought in the desert, a far greater threat emerged from the east. Temujin, born into a minor Mongol clan, united the fractious tribes of the steppe through sheer force of will and military genius. In 1206, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. His cavalry hordes were unstoppable. They conquered the Xijia and Jin empires in China, then turned west, utterly destroying the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia and Persia with a level of violence that spread terror. Cities that resisted were razed, their populations were slaughtered or used as human shields. By Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. His successors expanded it further. In the west, they crushed Russian and Polish armies, reaching the gates of Central Europe. In the east, they completed the conquest of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. For a time, the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, secured the Silk Road, allowing for the unprecedented flow of goods, ideas, and technologies between Europe and Asia. However, this same network would soon carry a devastating plague. In the 1340s, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, arrived in Europe from Asia via trade routes. It was a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable scale, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. As the Italian writer Boccaccio described, society broke down. But from this devastation came unexpected change. The scarcity of labor empowered surviving peasants to demand better wages and rights, beginning the slow breakdown of the feudal system. Amid this turmoil, new powers were rising. In West Africa, Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, embarked on a Hajj to Mecca in 1324 with a caravan so laden with gold that he caused inflation in the economies of the regions he passed through. He used his wealth to turn Timbuktu into a legendary center of Islamic learning. In the Americas, the Aztecs were building their empire. According to legend, they founded their capital, Tenochtitlan, on an island in Lake Texcoco, where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. The city grew into a marvel of engineering, with canals, causeways, and floating gardens called chinampas. In Europe, the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France raged, featuring the heroic tale of Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who led the French army to victory before being burned at the stake by the English. The war ultimately solidified national identities in both countries. But the most symbolic end came in the East. The Byzantine Empire, a shadow of its former self, was now reduced to no more than the city of Constantinople. In 1453, the young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to the city with massive cannons. On May 29th, after a desperate defense, the walls were breached. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the streets. Constantinople fell, and with it, the final remnant of the Roman Empire was extinguished. Mehmed made the city his new capital, and it was renamed Istanbul. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The Middle Ages were over. The world was now poised for a new age of exploration, rediscovery, and global connection, with a powerful Ottoman Empire straddling the crossroads of the world. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe, closing an ancient trade route and spurring a desperate search for new paths to the riches of the East. This age of exploration would accidentally connect two hemispheres, with catastrophic consequences for one and unprecedented power for the other. Simultaneously, a revolution in thought and faith shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom. As the Ottoman Empire consolidated its power, a cultural rebirth was flowering in the warring city-states of Italy. The Renaissance, a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, shifted the focus of human endeavor from the divine to the human. The philosophy of humanism celebrated human potential and individual achievement. This new spirit was embodied by Renaissance men like Leonardo da Vinci, who painted the enigmatic Mona Lisa while filling notebooks with scientific and anatomical drawings, and Michelangelo, who sculpted the perfect David and painted the sublime ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. In politics, Niccolò Machiavelli, in his seminal work The Prince, observed power with cold realism, arguing that it was safer to be feared than loved. The Age of Exploration and the Columbian Exchange. Driven by God, gold, and glory, European sailors took to the seas. In 1492, the Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, made landfall in the Bahamas, believing he had reached the Indies. His voyages opened the floodgates. The Spanish conquistadors followed. Hernán Cortés, with a few hundred men, exploited local alliances and superior technology to topple the mighty Aztec Empire by 1521. Francisco Pizarro repeated the feat, conquering the Inca Empire in Peru. The encounter was not merely a military conquest, it was a biological cataclysm. Europeans brought with them diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity. The resulting pandemics killed up to 90% of the indigenous population, a collapse so severe it reshaped the ecology of the Americas. This Columbian exchange was a two-way street. While the Old World gave the New World diseases, horses, and guns, the Americas gave the world potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and tobacco, crops that would revolutionize diets and fuel population growth across Europe and Asia. In 1517, a German monk and theologian named Martin Luther, outraged by the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, pardons for sins, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. Thanks to the printing press, his ideas spread like wildfire. He argued for salvation by faith alone, not deeds, and the Bible as the sole source of religious authority, rejecting the Pope's power. The Reformation shattered the religious monopoly of the Catholic Church. New Protestant denominations emerged under leaders like John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli. In England, King Henry VIII, denied an annulment by the Pope, broke with Rome and declared himself the head of the new Church of England. The Catholic Church fought back with its own counter-reformation, but Europe was now irrevocably divided along religious lines. This division plunged Europe into over a century of devastating conflict. In France, the Wars of Religion, 1562 to 1598, saw Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, massacre each other, culminating in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. In Russia, Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, centralized power with a reign of terror, using his secret police, the Oprichnina, to crush the nobility. The conflict reached its climax in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, a brutal and complex conflict that started as a religious war in the Holy Roman Empire but spiraled into a general European war for political supremacy. Mercenary armies ravaged the countryside, leading to the deaths of millions from violence, famine, and disease. The war ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the modern concept of state sovereignty and effectively ended the dream of a unified Christian Europe, cementing the era of the sovereign, independent nation-state. By 1648, the world was unrecognizable from 2 centuries prior. The hemispheres were connected, a new global economy was forming, and the map of Europe had been redrawn by faith and fire. The stage was set for a new era of revolution, reason, and global empire. Emerging from the ashes of religious war, Europe entered an age of radical new ideas. The Enlightenment championed reason, science, and individual rights, challenging the very foundations of monarchy and divine right. These ideas would soon ignite revolutions that toppled kings and created new republics, all while a technological revolution began to fundamentally reshape human society. In the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of London, philosophers began to reimagine society. John Locke argued that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed and that citizens had natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Montesquieu proposed the separation of governmental powers. Voltaire used his wit to skewer religious intolerance and censorship. Their ideas spread through an increasingly literate public and a growing print culture. Paradoxically, this age of reason also saw the peak of enlightened absolutism, where monarchs used the language of reform to centralize their own power. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, famously declared, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, and built the magnificent palace of Versailles as a monument to his power. In Russia, Peter the Great dragged his nation into the modern age by force, westernizing its customs and building a new capital, St. Petersburg, as a window to the West. Enlightenment ideas soon produced revolutionary action. In North America, resentment over British taxes without representation boiled over. The American Declaration of Independence in 1776, penned by Thomas Jefferson, was a direct embodiment of Enlightenment philosophy, declaring that all men are created equal with unalienable rights. Against the odds, the American colonists, with crucial French aid, won their war for independence, creating the world's first modern democratic republic. The American Revolution inspired a far more radical and bloody uprising in France. In 1789, crippled by debt and social inequality, the French people rose up, storming the Bastille prison. The French Revolution overthrew the monarchy, executed King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, and unleashed the Reign of Terror. The revolutionary cry of liberty, equality, fraternity echoed across the continent. Though the revolution eventually gave way to the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte, its ideals of nationalism and popular sovereignty would never be extinguished. While political revolutions reshaped governments, an economic and technological revolution began to transform daily life. Starting in Britain in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution replaced muscle power with machine power. Key inventions like James Watt's steam engine, the spinning jenny, and the power loom mechanized textile production. Factories sprang up, drawing millions from the countryside into rapidly expanding and often squalid industrial cities. This shift from an agricultural to a manufacturing economy created unprecedented wealth for nations and industrialists, but also immense social strain. A new class structure emerged: the industrial bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the wage workers, who often labored in dangerous conditions for meager pay. This new world of smoke, steel, and class conflict was captured by the thinkers of the time. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, championed free market capitalism, while Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, 1848, called on the workers of the world to unite and overthrow their bourgeois oppressors. The Industrial Revolution also fueled a new wave of imperialism. European nations, needing raw materials for their factories and new markets for their goods, engaged in the scramble for Africa, carving up the continent at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85 with little regard for existing ethnic or political boundaries. By 1914, nearly all of Africa was under European control. In the Americas, the old colonial empires were in retreat. Inspired by the American and French revolutions, Simón Bolívar led wars of independence that freed most of South America from Spanish rule. The age of empire based on divine right was over. replaced by a new age of industrial empire, nationalist fervor, and ideological struggle between the classes. The world, now connected by steam and steel, was hurtling toward a conflict of unprecedented scale. As the Enlightenment's philosophical currents swept across the Atlantic, they ignited a revolutionary fire in the 13 American colonies. This chapter chronicles the birth of a new nation, the violent upheaval of France, and the rise of a military genius whose ambitions would redraw the map of Europe. The roots of the American Revolution lay in the aftermath of the global 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which left Britain victorious but deeply in debt. To raise revenue, Parliament imposed a series of taxes on the American colonies, such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, under the principle of taxation without representation. Colonial resistance escalated from protest to open rebellion. The Boston Massacre of 1770 and the Boston Tea Party of 1773 heightened tensions. In 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. The following year, the Second Continental Congress took the radical step of declaring independence. The Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson, was a profound Enlightenment document. It asserted that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It stated that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed and have a responsibility to protect these rights. This was a direct challenge to the old order of monarchy and hereditary privilege. The war that followed was a desperate struggle. The Continental Army, led by General Washington, faced the world's most powerful military. Key to their ultimate success were Washington's leadership in keeping the army intact through brutal winters at Valley Forge, a pivotal victory at Saratoga, 1777, which convinced France to enter the war as an ally, and the final decisive triumph at the Siege of Yorktown, 1781, where a combined American and French force trapped the British Army under General Cornwallis. The Treaty of Paris in 1833 formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation then faced a monumental task, creating a government. Mindful of the tyranny they had rebelled against, the founders were wary of concentrated power. They first created a weak central government under the Articles of Confederation, but its failures led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The resulting U.S. Constitution was a novel experiment. It created a federal system with a separation of powers among executive, legislative, and judicial branches, designed to check and balance one another. In a compromise between large and small states, Congress was divided into a House of Representatives, based on population, and a Senate with equal representation. To address Plato's ancient warning about the fickle nature of the common voter, they instituted an electoral college for presidential elections. The subsequent edition of the Bill of Rights, 1791, guaranteed fundamental individual liberties, completing the framework for the world's first modern constitutional republic. Inspired by the American Revolution and burdened by its own crippling debt and archaic social structure, France erupted in 1789. The Third Estate, the Commoners, formed the National Assembly and, in a dramatic act of defiance, swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disperse until they had written a new constitution. The revolution began with hope, symbolized by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. However, it quickly radicalized. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, marked the start of popular violence. The monarchy was abolished, and King Louis XVI was executed in 1793. This began the Reign of Terror, led by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, during which tens of thousands deemed enemies of the revolution were sent to the guillotine. The revolution's chaos created an opportunity for a young, ambitious artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose to prominence by suppressing a royalist uprising and winning brilliant campaigns in Italy. In 1799, he staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the ineffective Directory and establishing himself as first consul. By 1804, he had crowned himself Emperor of the French. Napoleon was a transformative figure. He centralized the French state, reformed the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, which guaranteed equality before the law and property rights, and modernized administration. But he was also a military expansionist. For over a decade, his Grande Armée dominated Europe, defeating a series of coalitions arrayed against him. His power seemed inassailable until his fateful decision to invade Russia in 1812. The campaign was a catastrophe, destroying his army in the brutal Russian winter. Defeated and exiled, Napoleon staged a dramatic return for a final 100 days in 1815. His last gamble ended at the Battle of Waterloo, where he was decisively defeated by a coalition led by the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard von Blücher. He was exiled for good to the remote island of St. Helena, and the European powers met at the Congress of Vienna to restore the old monarchical order and redraw the continent's borders, attempting to turn back the clock on the revolutionary era he had embodied. The post-Napoleonic peace, engineered by the Congress of Vienna, created a fragile century of relative stability in Europe. Beneath the surface, however, powerful new forces were unleashed: industrialization, nationalism, and imperialism that would reshape the globe and ultimately lead to the first total war in human history. Beginning in Britain in the late 18th century and spreading across Europe and America, the Industrial Revolution marked humanity's transition from an agrarian to a manufacturing society. The steam engine, pioneered by James Watt, became the beating heart of this new age. It powered factories filled with mechanized looms and spinning jennies, which dramatically increased textile production. Later, the invention of the steam locomotive and the railroad shrank continents, while the telegraph annihilated distance in communication. This transformation created immense wealth, but also profound social dislocation. Cities swelled with a new working class, the proletariat, who often lived in squalor and worked long hours in dangerous conditions for meager wages. A new middle class, the bourgeoisie, rose to prominence, owning the means of production and championing liberal ideals. This new class struggle was captured by the German philosopher Karl Marx, who, in the Communist Manifesto 1848 with Friedrich Engels, predicted a workers' revolution and called for the overthrow of the capitalist system. Industrialized nations, desperate for raw materials and new markets for their goods, engaged in a frantic race for colonies. The scramble for Africa reached its peak at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, where European powers divided the continent with arbitrary borders, ignoring ethnic and cultural realities. By 1914, nearly 90% of Africa was under European control. In Asia, the British consolidated their rule in India, and Western powers forced China into a series of unequal treaties. Meanwhile, the United States completed its own continental expansion, fueled by the doctrine of manifest destiny. The belief that it was America's God-given right to expand westward led to the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the displacement and subjugation of Native American tribes. The nation was becoming a continental power, but deep sectional divisions over the issue of slavery were pulling it apart, culminating in the bloody Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The unifying force of nationalism, which had helped create Germany and Italy as unified nations, also became a destructive one. In the multi-ethnic empires of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, subject peoples began agitating for their own independence. a complex and rigid system of alliances divided Europe into two armed camps, the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Great Britain, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The tinderbox was ignited on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. A Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. A cascade of ultimatums and mobilizations, driven by these alliances and military timetables, plunged Europe into a war that few wanted, but no one knew how to stop. World War I, 1914 to 1918, was a conflict of unprecedented scale and horror. It was not the war of movement and glory that generals had expected. Instead, it bogged down into the nightmare of trench warfare on the Western Front. Soldiers lived in squalid conditions, facing artillery barrages, machine gun fire, poison gas, and the constant threat of disease in a scarred landscape of mud and corpses. Battles like Verdun and the Somme became synonyms for senseless slaughter, claiming millions of lives for gains measured in yards. The war was truly global, with fighting in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Africa. It was also total war, mobilizing entire populations and economies for the fight. New technologies, tanks, aircraft, and submarines were deployed, but they could not break the stalemate for years. The entry of the United States in 1917, following Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, finally tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. Exhausted and with its own resources spent and its people in revolt, Germany agreed to an armistice, which came into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The war shattered the old world order. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires collapsed. A generation of young men was lost, and the psychological trauma of the war haunted the survivors. The war to end all wars had instead sown the seeds for an even greater conflict, as the harsh peace terms of the Treaty of Versailles would create a bitter resentment in Germany, setting the stage for the rise of new, radical ideologies. While the previous chapter spanned the globe, the 19th century also contained a pivotal national drama whose outcome would define the future of a rising power, the United States of America. This chapter focuses on the great contradiction at the heart of the American experiment, the existence of slavery in a nation founded on liberty, and the bloody war that resolved it. From its inception, the United States was haunted by a fundamental hypocrisy. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet the nation's economy, particularly in the southern states, was built on the brutal institution of chattel slavery. The Constitution itself contained compromises, counting enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for representation, thereby embedding the issue in the very fabric of the government. For decades, a series of political compromises, the Missouri Compromise, 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, attempted to balance the power between free and slave states. But the underlying moral and economic conflict was irreconcilable. The abolitionist movement, fueled by religious fervor and Enlightenment principles, grew increasingly vocal, while the Southern states became more entrenched in their defense of slavery as a positive good, essential to their plantation-based society. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a Republican firmly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories, was the final straw for the South. Viewing his election as an existential threat, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America before Lincoln even took office. The war began in April 1861 when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a Union garrison in South Carolina. The Civil War pitted brother against brother in a conflict of staggering cost. It was the first modern war, featuring rifled muskets, ironclad warships, trench warfare, and total war tactics against civilian infrastructure. Early Confederate victories gave way to a grueling war of attrition. The Union's overwhelming advantages in population, industrial capacity, and naval power slowly strangled the Confederacy. Two key turning points came in 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg halted Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North, and the fall of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. Most consequentially, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all enslaved people in rebel-held territory to be free. This transformed the war from a conflict solely to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom, and it prevented European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. The Union victory in 1865 preserved the United States as a single, indivisible nation, but it also triggered a social and political revolution known as Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the U.S., and the 15th Amendment, 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. For a brief period, African Americans voted, held public office, and experienced a measure of freedom. However, this new birth of freedom was tragically short-lived. A violent backlash from white Southerners, the withdrawal of federal troops, and the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, along with Northern political fatigue, led to the Compromise of 1877. This deal effectively ended Reconstruction, ushering in the Jim Crow era of legalized segregation and disenfranchisement that would last for nearly a century. The Civil War resolved the question of secession and destroyed the institution of slavery, but it left the nation with the unfinished revolution of securing true racial equality. The promise of the Reconstruction Amendments would remain a deferred dream, a central tension in American life that would ignite again in the century to come. The 20th century was an age of terrifying extremes, unprecedented global wars, radical ideologies, technological miracles, and a shadow conflict that threatened total annihilation. Humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction reached its zenith. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 triggered a chain reaction of alliances, plunging Europe into World War I. It was a brutal stalemate of trench warfare, poison gas, and industrial-scale slaughter that shattered empires and a generation's innocence. From the ashes of the Russian Empire, a new and terrifying ideology was born. Exhausted by war, the Russian people overthrew the Tsar in the February Revolution of 1917. This was followed by the Bolshevik Revolution, where Vladimir Lenin's communists seized power, promising peace, land, and bread. They established the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union, and withdrew from the war, executing the royal family and plunging Russia into a bloody civil war. The punitive Treaty of Versailles, which ended WW1, humiliated Germany and created fertile ground for extremism. The global economic collapse of the Great Depression further destabilized democracies. In Italy, Benito Mussolini rose with his fascist ideology of ultranationalism and state control. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party exploited popular anger, scapegoating Jews and other minorities for Germany's problems. Upon gaining power, he established a totalitarian state and began a relentless campaign of territorial expansion. The policy of appeasement by Britain and France failed to stop him. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 ignited World War II. This conflict was even more global and destructive than the first, featuring blitzkrieg warfare, the aerial bombing of cities, and the systematic genocide of the Holocaust, the state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in Nazi death camps. The war in Europe ended in 1945 with Hitler's defeat, but the war in the Pacific concluded only after the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing the terrifying power of nuclear fission and ushering in a new existential fear for all humanity. The wartime alliance between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union quickly disintegrated. The world was divided into two hostile spheres of influence in a decades-long standoff known as the Cold War. This ideological struggle between democracy and communism was fought through proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, a relentless nuclear arms race, and the constant threat of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Europe was physically split by the Iron Curtain, symbolized by the Berlin Wall built in 1961 to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. The world watched in terror during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day standoff that brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. Yet even in this shadow conflict, humanity reached for the stars, culminating in the American Apollo 11 mission, landing the first humans on the moon in 1969. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy was stagnating. The policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, glasnost, and perestroika aimed to reform the system, but instead unleashed forces he could not control. In 1989, the people of Eastern Europe peacefully rose up, and the Berlin Wall was torn down. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved, ending the Cold War. The 20th century closed with the collapse of history's last great land empire and the triumph of liberal democracy, or so it seemed. The stage was set for a new, unpredictable era defined by globalization, terrorism, and a digital revolution that would connect the world in ways previously unimaginable. The collapse of the Soviet Union ended the bipolar world of the Cold War, leaving the United States as the sole superpower in a unipolar moment. This new era has been defined by the explosive growth of globalization, the digital revolution, and a complex new landscape of threats and challenges that transcend national borders. The late 20th century saw the rise of a technology that would fundamentally reshape human society, the personal computer. This was followed by the creation of the World Wide Web in the 1990s, which connected these computers into a global network. The Internet revolutionized communication, commerce, and access to information, collapsing geographical distances and creating a new virtual public square. The pace of change accelerated with the rise of social media platforms and the smartphone, which put this connected world in everyone's pocket. The digital age has unleashed unprecedented creativity and economic opportunity, but it has also created new perils: the erosion of privacy, the spread of disinformation, cyber warfare, and a growing digital divide. The post-Cold War era was marked by accelerated globalization, the free flow of goods, capital, and people across borders. International institutions like the World Trade Organization promoted free trade, and supply chains became global, leading to lower costs and greater efficiency. For a time, it seemed the world was converging toward a single integrated market. However, globalization also produced a powerful backlash. The 2008 global financial crisis, which began in the United States and spread worldwide, exposed the fragility of this interconnected system. The outsourcing of jobs from developed nations bred economic anxiety and political resentment, fueling the rise of populist and nationalist movements that questioned the benefits of global integration. The hope for a new world order of peace and cooperation was short-lived. The 21st century began with a devastating new form of conflict on September 11, 2001, when the terrorist group Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. This triggered a global war on terror, leading to prolonged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. While the threat of nuclear war between superpowers receded, new dangers emerged: rogue states seeking nuclear weapons, the rise of China as a strategic competitor, and a resurgent Russia challenging the post-Cold War settlement. The world became multipolar and less predictable. Furthermore, a long-term challenge identified decades earlier began to demand immediate attention: climate change. Driven by industrial activity and carbon emissions, global warming emerged as an existential threat, causing extreme weather, rising sea levels, and ecosystem collapse, and forcing a global, yet often divided, response. As we look to the future, we are reminded of the story that began this epic journey, the quest of Gilgamesh for immortality. He learned that while individual life is fleeting, humanity's collective story endures. We have progressed from atoms to apostles, from pyramids to microprocessors, from divine kings to universal human rights. The history of human civilization remains an incomplete book, constantly being written. The old patterns persist. Empires rise and fall. Technology transforms life, and the masses seek safety and meaning. But the narrative is now in our hands. The same species that painted in caves and tamed fire now holds the power to code reality and edit genes. The choices we make, guided by the lessons of our long and tumultuous past, will write the next chapter in the extraordinary, unfinished story of us. As the digital age matures, humanity stands on the cusp of transformations that promise to redefine the very fabric of our existence. This final chapter explores the emerging frontiers, technological, environmental, and existential, that will shape the narrative of the 21st century and beyond. We are now in the early stages of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, characterized by a fusion of technologies blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. Key developments include artificial intelligence and automation. AI systems are advancing from performing simple tasks to complex decision-making. While promising unprecedented efficiency and medical breakthroughs, this raises profound questions about the future of work, economic inequality, and the very nature of human consciousness and agency. Biotechnology and gene editing. Technologies like CRISPR-Cas9 give scientists the ability to edit genes with precision, offering the potential to eradicate hereditary diseases. However, they also open the door to ethical dilemmas concerning designer babies, genetic enhancement, and the fundamental definition of what it means to be human. The quantum leap. Quantum computing, harnessing the strange properties of quantum mechanics, promises processing power that could solve problems intractable for today's supercomputers, revolutionizing fields from medicine to cryptography, and fundamentally altering the global balance of technological power. The challenge of climate change has evolved from a future threat to a present-day crisis. The consequences of a warming planet, intensifying wildfires, powerful hurricanes, rising sea levels, and mass migrations are now tangible. The central drama of this century will be humanity's collective response. The transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources is not just an environmental goal, but a geopolitical and economic reorganization of global society. The future will be shaped by our success or failure in managing this planetary-scale problem. These technological and environmental shifts are straining our traditional social and political structures. The information ecosystem. The digital public square, once hailed as a democratizing force, is now a battleground of misinformation, algorithmic polarization, and eroding trust in institutions. Navigating this landscape and forging a shared sense of truth is one of the most pressing social challenges. Geopolitical reconfiguration. The unipolar moment is over. The world is moving toward a multipolar order with multiple centers of power, including the United States, China, and a resurgent bloc of nations in the global south. This new configuration increases the complexity of international cooperation on everything from trade to climate treaties. The quest for meaning. In an increasingly automated and interconnected world, fundamental questions about purpose, community, and identity are resurfacing. As AI handles more cognitive tasks, the uniquely human capacities for creativity, empathy, and wisdom may become the most valued currencies. Ancient Greece. From around 500 BC, this rugged land was the scene of remarkable developments in art, philosophy, and warfare. Its two greatest city-states were Athens, a naval power, where democracy, art, drama, and philosophy flourished, and Sparta, an austere militaristic society, famed for its formidable army. In 480 BC, these two city-states had joined forces to fight an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force, led by 300 Spartans, held up the enormous Persian army for 3 days before they were finally encircled and killed. Then, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy, but they couldn't prevent the Persians burning the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis. The next year, at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle against the Persians and forced them to abandon their invasion. The next 50 years were the golden age of classical Greece. But rising tension between Athens and Sparta and their allies eventually led to war, dragging the Greek world into decades of destructive fighting. Wars between the Greek city-states continued for almost a century, leaving them exhausted and vulnerable to a new, rising power to the north. For centuries, sophisticated Greeks had viewed the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a backwater, Hicksville, barely Greek at all. But under King Philip II, Macedonia emerged as a formidable military force. His most famous reform, the introduction of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, and wielded by trained infantry fighting in close formation, known as a phalanx. In 480 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. Through alliance and conquest, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighbors. Now, following this victory, he united all Greece in an alliance known as the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon, or supreme commander. Only Sparta stood aside. Philip began to plan a great campaign, a pan-Hellenic, or all-Greek war against the Persian Empire. Their old foe was now an ailing superpower, its great riches ripe for the taking. But on the eve of launching his war, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son Alexander, brilliant, restless, tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first he had to secure his own position as king. At home he had potential rivals executed, then crushed rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. He made a special example of Thebes, completely destroying the ancient city and selling its people into slavery. In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. The phalanx. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation presented a solid wall of iron spear tips and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks or rear. The hypaspists. Some 3,000 elite infantry, the hypaspists, or shield-bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The hoplites. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well-armed and heavily armored for the time. The skirmishers. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings, and bows. The cavalry. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callas, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Erigius, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, under Cassander. The great Persian Empire was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor, or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight. So they decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 10,000 horsemen from across the empire, Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind, in reserve, were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing, he posted Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry under Parmenion's command. In the center were the massed spears of the phalanx. On the right, Alexander himself, with the companion cavalry under Philotas, as well as the elite hypaspists, the Agrianes javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered. But ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault.
He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of Hypaspists and the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts, and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders was stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses, and men against men. The Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank, the Persians determined to prevent them crossing and push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then suddenly, Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by two Persian nobles. Rhoesaces rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then, from behind, Spithidides raised his sword against the king, but Black Cletus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now, the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy, but the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius, King of Kings, himself.
In 334 BC, Alexander, the 21-year-old king of Macedonia, led a coalition of Greek forces against the greatest power of the age, the Persian Empire. He led an army of skilled veterans, at its heart men of the Macedonian phalanx, armed with the 18-foot Sarissa pike and the elite horsemen of his companion cavalry. Together at the Battle of the River Granicus, they'd won a first decisive victory over the Persian army. Now, as Alexander approached Sardis, capital of the Persian province of Lydia, its commander surrendered without a fight. But before Alexander could advance further, he needed to neutralize Persian naval power. Persia had a powerful fleet, with major naval bases around the eastern Mediterranean, that could potentially cut his lines of communication back to Greece. Rather than challenge the Persians at sea, Alexander decided to attack their nearest bases, the Greek coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both put up determined resistance, but were taken by winter. The following spring of 333 BC, Alexander continued his advance into Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he was shown the legendary Gordian knot. A prophecy said that whoever could unpick it would rule all Asia. Alexander simply took his sword and sliced it in half. Meanwhile, Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, led Persian warships into the Aegean and captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos. But after Memnon's sudden death from illness, the offensive was abandoned. 18 months had passed since Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont and invaded the Persian Empire. Now Alexander led his men into Cilicia, and was soon poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. But then the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself, emerged behind the Greek army to the north. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2 to 1. so he moved his army to the coastal plain near Issus, just 6 miles wide from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius exploiting his huge numerical advantage. His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire, including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals. His best cavalry were massed on his right wing towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the center. Persian infantry formed his left wing. Alexander deployed his army for battle, once again entrusting his left wing, nearest the sea, to Parmenion, with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the center, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right wing toward the mountain slopes, his elite Agriani javelin throwers, his archers, and behind them the Hypaspists and the companion cavalry. When Alexander saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion on the left, he moved across his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinaris, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long. Alexander called out to his men, urging them to fight bravely, picking some of them by name. Then, at the head of his army's right wing, he charged. Once again, the speed and shock of the Macedonian advance sent the enemy reeling back. But in the center of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered. Now, in fierce fighting with the Greek mercenaries of Darius, the phalanx was slowly being driven back. Alexander, seeing the danger, regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries, threatened on their flank, were soon in disarray, and the Macedonian phalanx was able to resume its advance. Alexander fought his way towards the great king, Darius himself. Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king, Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot. Meanwhile, the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate fight against the best of the Persian cavalry. If the Persians could break through here, they could engulf Alexander's army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But Parmenion and his troops fought doggedly and continued to hold the Persians at bay. As the news that Darius had fled spread among his troops, they abandoned the fight and tried to save themselves. The battle turned into a massacre. Ptolemy, one of the Macedonian commanders, told Alexander there were so many Persian dead that his men had used them to fill a deep ravine so they could cross over it. The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander. And amongst the spoils of victory were Darius's wife, mother, and 3 children, all taken alive and well treated by Alexander. With the Persian field army in retreat, Alexander now turned to subduing the western territories of the Persian Empire. The next year, 332, the coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted to Alexander, ending Persian naval power in the Mediterranean, but the island city of Tyre resisted. Tyre's defenders fought bravely and skillfully, even when Alexander began building a causeway to the island, protected by 2 giant siege towers, which they counterattacked with fire ships. But after 7 months, the city walls were breached and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved. Gaza, too, was taken by siege. Alexander continued to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor of Egypt surrendered the entire province to Alexander, along with the royal treasury. At Memphis, priests of this ancient land welcomed Alexander as their liberator from Persian rule and crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria, then traveled to the desert oracle of Siwa, where, according to some accounts, the priests welcomed him as son of Amun,
king of the gods. Alexander returned east to Tyre, where in 331 BC he received news of trouble back home. Despite his great victories over the Persians, many Greeks regarded Alexander as a tyrant. King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, now launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, was already dealing with rebellion in Thrace, but he quickly marched south and met Agis in battle near the city of Megalopolis. Even the legendary Spartans were now no match for Macedonian military power. The Spartan army was crushed. King Agis himself was among the fallen. With his base in Greece secure once more, Alexander advanced towards the Persian heartlands, seeking a final showdown with Darius. He received a letter from the Persian king, offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's stunning victories, all the oracles and acclamations, had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world. He rejected the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire. He was coming to take it all. Despite his great victories over the Persians, many Greeks regarded Alexander as a tyrant. King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, now launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, was already dealing with rebellion in Thrace. But he quickly marched south and met Agis in battle near the city of Megalopolis. Even the legendary Spartans were now no match for Macedonian military power. The Spartan army was crushed. King Agis himself was among the fallen. With his base in Greece secure once more, Alexander advanced towards the Persian heartlands, seeking a final showdown with Darius. He received a letter from the Persian king, offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's stunning victories, all the oracles and acclamations, had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world. He rejected the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire. He was coming to take it all.
In 334 BC, Alexander, 21-year-old ruler of the small Greek kingdom of Macedonia, led an invasion of the vast Persian Empire. It seemed impossible odds, but thanks to Greek military dominance and Alexander's fearless leadership, he won two great battles against the Persians, at the river Granicus and at Issus. Having subdued Persian lands west of the Euphrates River, he now headed east into the empire's heartlands, seeking a final showdown with the Persian king Darius III. Receiving news that a great Persian army, led by Darius, had assembled at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in Iraq, he made straight for it. This was Darius's last chance to stop Alexander, and Alexander's chance to smash Persian power once and for all. Darius had chosen to fight on open ground, where his advantage in numbers would be more telling. His soldiers had also worked hard to clear and flatten the terrain to make it suitable for Persian war chariots. By modern estimates, the Persian army was between 50 and 80,000 strong, and made up of contingents from across the empire, infantry from Syria and Babylonia, cavalry from Armenia, India, and Central Asia, up to 200 scythed chariots, even a handful of war elephants. Alexander's army was smaller and may have been outnumbered by as much as 2 to 1. He deployed his units in their usual formation. On the left flank, Thracian and Thessalian cavalry commanded by Parmenion. In the center, the Macedonian veterans of the phalanx, each armed with their 18-foot sarissa pike. On the right flank, Alexander with his elite cavalry, the companions, and his best infantry, the hypaspists.
These were the units with which Alexander planned to launch his main attack. Greek hoplites formed a second line and supported both wings, which were angled back to guard against encirclement by the Persians. The battle began when Alexander led his wing out to the right, a move that took the Persians by surprise. Could Alexander really be trying to encircle their huge army? The Persians mirrored his movement, taking troops away from their center to outflank Alexander and prevent him leaving the area they'd cleared for the Persian chariots. But Alexander's unusual maneuver was a trap to entice the Persians to weaken their center. When he saw that it had worked, he ordered his Greek cavalry to charge to keep the Persians fixed in position. A giant cavalry battle developed on the right wing. Darius, meanwhile, judging this to be the decisive moment, unleashed his chariots. But expert Egrian javelin throwers took out horses and crews, while the Greek infantry opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Now, Alexander led his companion cavalry and parts of the Macedonian phalanx in a headlong charge straight at the weakened Persian center, fighting his way towards Darius himself. The sudden ferocity of Alexander's assault threw the Persians into panic. The center of the army broke and ran, King Darius himself leading the rout. But Alexander's left wing was in serious trouble. Parmenion, facing a huge onslaught by Persian cavalry, was virtually surrounded. Indian and Scythian horsemen had even ridden through a gap in the Greek line, but rather than wheeling and attacking the Greeks from behind, they'd carried straight on to loot their camp. Parmenion sent a desperate appeal to Alexander for help. The king abandoned his pursuit of Darius, regrouped, and charged the Persian right wing. It was the hardest and bloodiest fighting of the battle, claiming the lives of 60 of Alexander's companions. Finally, as news of Darius's flight spread across the battlefield, the last Persian horseman turned and fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a stunning and complete victory for Alexander. According to ancient sources, he lost just a few hundred men, while the Persians lost thousands. Alexander had routed Darius's great army, and now the road to Babylon, the empire's main capital, lay open. The Macedonian king entered the great city in triumph, recognized by Persian officials as its new rightful ruler. So too at the city of Susa, where Alexander ceremonially took his seat upon the royal throne of Persia. In the Zagros Mountains, at a pass known as the Persian Gates, a courageous Persian force held up Alexander's army for a month. The Greeks eventually found a mountain path that bypassed their position, allowing them to encircle and wipe out the defenders. In early 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis, the empire's ceremonial capital. Alexander wanted to appear as a liberator to the Persians, as a legitimate successor to King Darius, but now he ordered Persepolis to be pillaged and burnt, retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece and the burning of Athens' sacred temples in 480 BC. Alexander now headed north into Media, where Darius had taken refuge in the royal city of Ecbatana. Alexander was determined to capture Darius, but the fugitive king fled east in the hope of raising a new army in the provinces of Parthia, Bactria, and Sogdia. It was not to be. As Alexander closed in, the Persian king was murdered by one of his own governors, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself the empire's new ruler. Alexander gave orders for Darius to be buried in the royal tombs of Persepolis, alongside his ancestors. Then he paused to organize his vast new empire. Alexander appointed viceroys to rule the provinces on his behalf, keeping several Persians who had sworn loyalty in their posts. He also allowed Greek troops who wished to return home. Then he resumed his march east, his goal to find and kill the usurper Bessus, subjugate the empire's eastern provinces, and reach the far edge of the world. In 330 BC, Alexander continued his march east. His goal? To find and kill Bessus,
a Persian usurper claiming to be the rightful king, and to subjugate the empire's eastern provinces. Alexander headed first for Aria, today part of Afghanistan, where the Persian governor Satybarzanes had launched a revolt after initially pretending to submit to Alexander. The rebellion was crushed and Satybarzanes killed in single combat by a Greek cavalry officer. Nearby, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria Aria, modern Herat, in southern Afghanistan, one of around a dozen cities that Alexander would eventually found, almost all bearing his name. Alexander marched on to Frada. The Macedonian court had a long tradition of plots and assassination. 6 years before, Alexander's own father, King Philip, had been murdered by his bodyguard. He was now informed that Philotas, commander of his companion cavalry, had uncovered a plot to assassinate Alexander, but kept it secret. Philotas and his father, Parmenion, were among the most respected of Alexander's commanders and had played crucial roles in all his great victories. But when Philotas confessed under torture, Alexander had him executed, then sent assassins back to Ecbatana, where Parmenion was governor, to kill him before he even heard of his son's death, and had a chance to turn against Alexander. In 329, Alexander resumed his pursuit of Bessus. En route, he founded the city of Alexandria Arachosia, modern Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. As he reached Kunduz, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and handed over in chains. Alexander sent him back to Persia for execution as a kingslayer. Alexander pushed on into modern Tajikistan, where the Sogdians rose up against him. He had to fight off attacks by local tribes and take several towns by assault. On the banks of the Jaxartes River, he founded the city of Alexandria Eshkate, meaning Alexandria, the furthest, so named because he had, at last, reached the limit of the Persian Empire. This frontier was frequently raided by nomads, known to the Greeks as Scythians. Alexander lured them into a decisive battle near the Jaxartes. The result was a crushing victory for the Macedonian king that put an end to the raids. But fighting against Bactrian and Sogdian tribes continued, frustrating Alexander and tying him down in a difficult guerrilla war. By now, many of the Macedonian troops were unhappy with Alexander. Most had not seen their homes in years, but their king seemed bent on conquest without end. What was worse, he'd begun to adopt the rituals and dress of their defeated Persian enemy, customs they viewed as effeminate and decadent. At Matakanda, modern Samarkand, after a furious drunken argument, Alexander killed Clytus the Black. Clytus had been one of Alexander's best generals and the man who'd saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus. Alexander was full of remorse, but his growing arrogance was alienating more and more old comrades. When he tried to make his countrymen perform the traditional Persian ritual of proskynesis, prostrating themselves before the king, he crossed a line. To Greeks, this was blasphemy. Only a god was worthy of such respect, and Alexander was forced to back down. In Bactria, another plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. This time, the ringleader was a royal page, one of the sons of Macedonian nobility who attended the king. Hermolaus had become murderously bitter towards Alexander over a perceived injustice. He and his accomplices were tortured and then stoned to death. Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian, was also implicated in the conspiracy. He was thrown in prison, where he later died. That summer, in 327, according to legend, Alexander became captivated by the beauty of Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian lord. Their marriage was also a sound political move, helping to end local revolt against his rule and allowing him to continue his advance,
into modern Pakistan and India.
He followed the rivers of the Punjab to the sea, a journey that took 10 months. On the way, he defeated the Malians, but while leading the assault on their capital, was wounded in the chest and nearly killed. On reaching the coast, part of the army under Nearchus boarded ships and returned to Persia by sea, sailing through the Straits of Hormuz and entering the Persian Gulf. It was one of the great ancient voyages of exploration, as these waters had been previously unknown to Greeks. Meanwhile, Alexander led the rest of the army back by land through the Gadrosian Desert, today in southern Pakistan. But extreme heat and shortages of food and water led to terrible suffering and many deaths among his army.
On his return to Persia, Alexander executed several of his viceroys and governors, men accused of ruling unjustly and robbing temples and tombs during his long absence in the East. At Susa, he arranged a magnificent mass marriage of Macedonian officers to 80 Persian noblewomen to strengthen bonds between his two kingdoms. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses. He also paid all his soldiers' debts and ordered 30,000 youths from across the empire to be trained in the Macedonian art of war. But at Opis, his Macedonian troops mutinied. They were offended by Alexander's apparent preference for Persian advisors and Persian ways. Alexander had the ringleaders executed and made a speech to the men, reminding them of the glories they'd won together and leading eventually to an emotional reconciliation. At Ecbatana, Alexander's closest and most trusted friend, Hephaestion, died of fever. The king was grief-stricken, went days without eating, and ordered a period of public mourning across the empire. Alexander waged a successful campaign against the mountain raiders of Kosseia, who not even the Persian kings had been able to subdue. Returning to Babylon, he was met by embassies from distant peoples come to recognize his greatness: Ethiopians, Libyans, European Scythians, Lucanians, Etruscans, Gauls, and Iberians. Alexander's Bactrian wife Roxala was now pregnant, but as he planned his next campaign to Arabia and beyond, he developed a sudden fever and died days later, aged just 32. The cause of Alexander's death has never been established. It may have been malaria, cholera, typhus, or poison. Alexander died undefeated in battle. His reputation as a brilliant, fearless, and daring military commander remains undimmed. His decade-long campaign created one of the largest empires ever known, stretching from Greece to Pakistan. But it was vast and unstable, held together only by his own brilliance and name. Alexander left no plans for his succession, and his generals soon began fighting among themselves to carve out their own empires. In the wars of the successors, Alexander's widow Roxana and his young son were murdered. His own gold sarcophagus, en route to Macedonia for burial, was hijacked and ended up in Alexandria in Egypt. Today, its location remains one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. Few men have ever had such an impact on the course of history as Alexander the Great. The breathtaking achievements of his short life ushered in the Hellenistic age, as Greek ideas spread across the territory of his former empire, fusing with local traditions to trigger new developments in art, science, government, and language. Some of the successor kingdoms to his great empire were short-lived. Others endured for centuries, but all, in turn, would fall to new forces, and in the West, to the rising power of Rome.